The US class system works as ruthlessly and as efficiently as the UK one in somewhat different ways, but it does so under a veneer of classlessness. It does so partly camouflaged by the myth of meritocracy, by the idea that, well, here in America, anyone can get ahead, etc. And there's a couple of reasons why class is not discussed in the same way in the US. The really good one is because race is so much more salient as a fracture in US society. The bad one is the one I've alluded to, which is a kind of sense, well, we're a classless society. 90% of Americans define themselves as a middle class. And of course, there's a bit of a linguistic difference here, too, between the way middle class is used in the two countries. Who's destroying American dream? The answer is I am. Or at least the class of which I am now a member is. The American upper middle class are destroying the American dream whilst telling themselves that they are living it out and they're living proof of it. This shows you now the value of tax breaks, tax expenditures for the bottom 40, middle 40, and top 20. I won't go into detail, but basically what it shows you is that the tax breaks in the US are highly regressive, and particularly because of mortgage interest and capital gains deductions. But the American upper middle class know how to take care of themselves. This is the We Are the 1% chart. This is real incomes, the different groups. For the top 1% at the top, the 19% below them here, and then the middle 40 and the bottom 40. Look at that top 1%. There's a couple of things about that. One is that actually there's a lot of movement in and out of the top 1%. In the US, to get into the top 1%, you need a household income of just north of $400,000 a year. To get into the top fifth, you need an income of about $130,000 a year. These are household incomes. But there's actually quite a bit of movement between them, because if you have suddenly at 2 earners, that's enough to push some people in good labor markets into the top 1%. So in a 10-year spell, about 2 in 10 of this group will be in and out. The second thing is look at the left-hand scale. In order to capture the incomes of the top 1%, you have to really push up the left-hand scale. Social scientists do their dirty work in 2 places. One in the footnotes, with what deflator they've used or what assumptions they've made, and secondly in the left-hand scale. You can basically show anything if you just change the left-hand scale. So I'm about to do it too. Now it only goes for 200,000, and I've taken the top 1% out altogether. So it's the bottom 40, the next 40, and then the 19% above them, but not including the top 1%. It's not as dramatic a chart. But it is important to note that there's been no increase in income inequality in the bottom 80% of the US distribution. The bottom of the US distribution looks exactly the same today as it did in 1979. It's moved up a little bit, not much, but it looks exactly the same. No increase in inequality at all. So don't let people say, at least in the US context, there's a growing gap between rich and poor. That's not true. There's a growing gap between rich, however you define it, and everybody else. The bottom 80% are effectively being left behind. And then to a greater extent, as you go up towards the top, people are pulling away. So this is the pulling away of the top 19%. This is just income, but a class isn't just made by income. The second thing is that it endures across generations. I'm going to introduce you to something that we make at Brookings all the time, intergenerational income transition matrix. And basically, it shows quite a bit of mobility. It's like this is telling you that this is how many of the kids born poor stay poor as adults in the bottom 20%. Actually, if you do it for black and white or people from different family structures, it's very different. Plus, there's a lot of people in the US, 300 million. It's quite hard to interpret these sorts of charts. But my point here is simply that everyone always focuses on this, the perpetuation of poverty. Why are so many people stuck in poverty? But if it's relative, if it is a zero-sum game, let's just have a look at that as well. What's happening at the top? Is it that they're just so much better, that they deserve to stay at the top? Or is there something else going on that we might have a problem with? We might not. I'm just put up wealth for the sake of it, just to show that wealth, as you'd expect, is even stickier. So 44% of those who have parents in the top fifth will be in the top fifth of wealth. I'm going to say a bit about this distinction between relative and absolute mobility. Absolute mobility is being better off than your parents were at the same age. You get to 40, are you better off in real terms than your parents were at 40? You hope so if there's any economic growth that's in any way shared. Broadly, that's what you would hope for. Relative mobility is the kind I just showed you. It's necessarily a zero-sum game. And every politician that you ever speak to, where you show them a chart like this, they'll go, we've got to get more people rising up the income ladder. They say, that's great, but you know we'll have to move some people down. And they go, what? Say that again? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. I just want to move people up. OK. But relatively speaking, you can't. Now, that's not a moral statement. That's a mathematical statement. This is tax data collected by Raj Chetty, who's easily the leader in the field of intergenerational mobility because he has everyone's tax records. And he's showing here, depending on what year you're born in, what percentage of people are better off than their parents were at the same age. And so for the post-war generation, pretty much everyone was, 90% were. It's dropped to 50% now. Now, when your economy is growing at 4% a year, as it was between 1950 and 1974, you'd expect people to be getting better off. Plus, you've got to think about how terrible their parents' lives were. But nonetheless, the trend is very clear. Lower growth and higher inequality means that you've now got only about a 50% chance, if you're born in 1980, of being better off than your parents. That's low absolute mobility, falling absolute mobility. Why is that happening? And again, what they did was something quite clever. So 40 years ago, 90% of people were better off than their parents. It's now 50%. And then what they do is they model what would the mobility today, absolute mobility, be today if we had the same growth as we enjoyed in those years before, and what would it be but holding inequality constant. And then this one on the far right is, imagine if we had the same levels of equality, same distribution, but we still had low growth. The bottom line of this chart is that it's a combination of lower growth and less even distribution of the proceeds of that growth that has led to lower absolute mobility, but it's actually more about inequality. The way that I think about it now, this is from a friend of mine, Steve Pearlstein, he said, think about an era of high growth and high absolute mobility as driving along a road and everyone's doing fine. Someone overtakes you. Do you mind? Not really, unless you have deeper problems. So in an era of high absolute mobility and growth, there may be a bit of relative position change. Someone overtaking you or overtaking your kids doesn't feel so painful. But in an era of low growth, low absolute mobility, where everything feels more congested, everything feels tighter, the stakes feel higher. And then you really do mind if someone manages to get in front of you, because suddenly the stakes feel higher. And so ironically, a period of kind of lower growth, lower absolute mobility, means that relative mobility, the positional status, is probably, in my view, both more important but also more difficult, because the stakes just got higher.